Welcome to Sleepytime History. True stories from the pages of history for a full night's rest. If this is your first time listening, let us know where you're tuning in from, or make a request for a future episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us immensely. All right, it's time to settle in, relax, and take a wander through the pages of history and storytelling. Tonight, we're going to be exploring the haunting tale of Jacob Waltz, better known as the Dutchman, a solitary prospector whose secretive life gave rise to one of the greatest unsolved legends of the American West, a hidden gold mine whose wealth and whereabouts remain shrouded in mystery. For more than a century, whispers have drifted through the dusty, arid winds of the Arizona desert, carrying tales of an elusive treasure concealed deep within the rugged folds of the Superstition mountains. Rumors spoke of gold so pure and plentiful that even seasoned miners found themselves astonished by its brilliance. At the center of these stories stood Jacob Waltz, a quiet, enigmatic figure who lived on the outskirts of town. During the winter, Waltz would vanish into the mountains, only to return with saddlebags heavy with gold of astonishing purity. Waltz never revealed his path. He left no map, and those who attempted to follow him often disappeared without a trace. He guarded his secret closely, speaking of it to no one, until the very end. As his life drew to a close, Waltz entrusted some of his secrets to a young man named Dick Holmes. This ignited a legacy of treasure seekers who dedicated their lives, or even sacrificed them, to the endless pursuit of a wondrous, hidden fortune. This story isn't just about an elusive treasure. It's about the enduring mystery of America's most famous lost mine, a legend that has survived gunfighters, treasure hunters, scholars, and adventurers alike. So settle in, take a deep breath, and journey gently now into the quiet shadows and desert whispers, following the footsteps of the Dutchman, Jacob Waltz. Arriving in the Arizona Territory in the 1860s, Waltz was lean and quiet. He was alone. He spoke little, but his accent betrayed him. Not Dutch as many believed, but German. His surname Waltz often softened in speech, until the locals called him the Dutchman. The name stuck. It suited him somehow. Foreign, distant, and hard to pin down. He settled on the outskirts of Phoenix, a dusty frontier town not yet tamed by time or law. He built a modest home, grew a small garden, and made just enough conversation to pass for another tired old prospector. But Jacob Waltz was different. Each winter, as the air cooled and the rains softened the land, he would vanish, alone. No fanfare, no announcement, just a pack mule, some provisions, and a slow ride east toward the Superstition Mountains, a place the local Apache had long held sacred, and others feared for different reasons. Stories clung to those peaks like mist. Men went in and didn't come out. Waltz always came back, and when he did, he brought gold. Not flakes or dust, but solid veins embedded in quartz, thick and heavy, so rich in purity it shimmered unnaturally in the sun. Those who saw it said it was nearly 1/3 gold by weight, an impossibly rich yield, unlike anything found in the region before. But no one could say where it came from. He never brought back maps. He never said a word about where he'd been. He lived frugally, never spent wildly, and never gave reason for suspicion. And yet, the gold kept coming. Shopkeepers whispered. Assayers widened their eyes. A few tried to follow him, but he always vanished into the hills, then reappeared weeks or months later, calm as ever, with just enough gold to keep himself comfortable for another season. To the townspeople, he was a curiosity, a local oddity. To the other prospectors, he was something more. Proof that somewhere in those mountains, somewhere among the buttes and ravines and ancient stone, was a mine so valuable it could change a man's life forever. Waltz never said a word to confirm it, but he never denied it either. He simply lived, as if he was keeping something at bay. There was no family, no companions, only one woman, Julia Thomas, a local shopkeeper who spoke his language and seemed to have earned his trust. They were seen together from time to time, quiet conversations, shared glances, but even she never claimed to know where he went. He grew older, but he did not slow down. Year after year, he returned to the mountains, drawn like a moth to some unseen flame. And each time, he returned a little more tired and a little more burdened. Those who saw him up close noticed it in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but something colder. Something he carried with him, like the weight of a story never told. A secret, perhaps, or a memory. And behind it all, a gold mine that no one could prove existed. And yet, somehow, everyone believed was real. There are stories that feel like legend from the very beginning, too large, too strange, too perfectly hidden to be real. But for Jacob Waltz, the story of the mine wasn't myth, it was memory. He had found it years earlier, during one of his many ventures into the Superstition mountains. The year was 1877, and Waltz had been prospecting far into the rugged folds of the Arizona wilderness. He was alone, as always, searching the high washes and hidden ravines, where gold might hide beneath layers of volcanic rock and time. That part of the range was wild even by frontier standards. No maps, no trails, only shifting landmarks and the silence of the high desert wind. One day, his search was cut short. He was ambushed, perhaps by Apache warriors, perhaps by bandits. Accounts vary, and Waltz never spoke of it clearly. What is certain is that he escaped, injured and desperate, stumbling blindly through the rocky desert in search of water, food, and shelter. And that was when he found the footprints. Boot prints, not moccasins, proof of other men nearby. He followed them through a winding canyon until he came upon a small camp tucked in the shadow of the hills. 3 Mexican miners had pitched a fire, and they welcomed him cautiously. In their tired conversation, they spoke of what they had found. A thick vein of gold, so rich it was almost too much to believe. They showed it to him, and that was the moment everything changed. What Waltz saw was extraordinary. The ore was unlike anything he'd encountered in decades of prospecting, heavy with visible gold, running thick through white quartz, with veins as wide as his forearm. In today's terms, it would have been worth millions. To a man like Waltz, alone and hardened, it wasn't just fortune, it was fate. What happened next, no one can say for certain. But he returned from the mountains alone. The other men were never seen again. The canyon they had spoken of, lost to memory, never mapped, and never found by another soul. Waltz had not just discovered the mine, he had claimed it, and he would guard it the rest of his life. He never mined it openly, never filed a claim. He returned each winter and worked it in secret, slowly, methodically, taking only what he could carry out quietly. He was careful never to draw attention, never to leave obvious trails. He buried signs, altered paths, and worked by moonlight when needed. He told no one where it was, but each season he returned with just enough gold to keep his small life afloat, just enough to make others wonder, just enough to make men whisper. To Waltz, the mine was more than a source of wealth. It was a possession, a secret earned through hardship, blood, and silence. He had taken it for himself, and in doing so, he had severed any hope of sharing it. To speak of it was to invite others, and to him, that was unthinkable. He became more isolated, more guarded. He took fewer chances and trusted no one, not even those who showed him kindness. The mine had given him everything he needed, but it had also become something else, a burden. The deeper he kept it hidden, the more it seemed to possess him in return. It was his alone, but he knew that wouldn't last forever. And when his time came, as all men's time does, he would have to choose whether to take the secret with him or leave behind a trail for someone willing to bear the same weight. Years passed, and Jacob Waltz became a fixture in Phoenix, a familiar figure with an unfamiliar life. He was often seen walking the edge of town, his gait stiff with age, his clothes plain and sun-bleached. He spoke little, kept to himself, and lived in a modest adobe home, shaded by a small mesquite tree. To the casual eye, he looked like every other aging prospector who hadn't struck it rich. But Waltz had struck it rich, very rich, and he had done it alone. He kept his gold hidden, not in banks or beneath floorboards, but in the rhythms of his life. A quiet purchase here, a loan repaid in heavy ore there. The samples he brought in for trade were unlike any seen in the territory. Flecked with gold so pure, it barely needed refining. Assayers who examined it often looked up in disbelief, but no one could get close to him. Over time, a few tried. Shopkeepers, traders, and fellow miners would ask about his source. He'd smile faintly, offer nothing, and move on. He had become a man of riddles, not because he enjoyed mystery, but because he had no room for risk. His secret was too large to share. Still, one woman stood apart from the rest. Julia Thomas ran a small shop in town, an ice cream and oyster parlor of all things, a rarity in the harsh desert heat. She was a capable woman, independent and resilient, and she spoke German, Waltz's native tongue. In a town full of strangers, this gave her a foothold, and in time, a kind of connection formed between them. Waltz trusted her, at least a little, enough to speak freely now and then, enough to accept her care when his strength began to wane. Whether friendship or something gentler, their bond was one of the few human ties the old man allowed himself. And then came the flood. In the spring of 1891, a massive rainstorm swept through Phoenix, turning the dry washes into surging rivers. Homes were destroyed, livestock drowned. Half the town was swept away, including the modest shack Waltz had called home. He was found afterward, cold and frail, his belongings scattered or lost. Julia took him in, setting up a cot in the back room of her shop, offering him warmth, food, and silence. But the flood had done more than take his house. It had taken his health. Waltz grew weaker by the day. His breathing thinned. The light behind his eyes began to dim. And still, he said nothing of the mine. Out in town, a quiet urgency began to spread. Those who had long suspected Waltz of hoarding a secret now wondered if he might die without ever revealing it. Some believed he had shared the location with Julia. Others believed he'd taken it to the grave already, locked behind weathered lips. But one man still watched from the edges, a man who had once tried to follow Waltz into the hills, a man who remembered a campfire story from years earlier about a mysterious old miner and a gold mine deep in the Superstitions. That man was Dick Holmes. And as Waltz's strength ebbed in the back room of Julia's shop, Dick waited, not for gold, not for fame, but for a chance to hear the truth, before the mountain reclaimed it forever. It was October of 1891, and the Dutchman was fading. Jacob Waltz lay still in the quiet back room of Julia Thomas's shop, wrapped in a rough blanket, a single candle flickering against the wall. His breath came thin, ragged at times, as though each exhale might be his last. Outside, the town of Phoenix moved on. Wagons clattered down dirt streets, horses drank from muddy troughs, and the desert sun warmed the rooftops. But inside, time had slowed. Word had spread that Waltz was dying. Julia had done all she could, given him shelter, warmth, and a place to rest, but she couldn't be at his side forever. So one morning, when the old man took a sudden turn, she slipped outside to fetch a doctor. And that's when Dick Holmes appeared. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps he had been waiting. Whatever the truth, Julia saw him and asked if he might sit with the old man until she returned. Dick stepped quietly into the room, and for the first time sat face to face with the man he had followed from afar. The man he believed held the key to the most elusive treasure in the American West. He expected instructions, directions, something clear, but instead he received a confession. For nearly an hour, Waltz spoke, slowly, in fragments, often pausing to catch his breath or drift briefly into silence. What emerged was not a map, but a history. He told of a time, years earlier, when he had been stranded in the mountains, hungry, alone, and then, by sheer chance, he'd found a camp, 3 Mexican miners, strangers, who welcomed him cautiously. They had discovered a mine beyond belief, and they showed it to him without fear. What happened after was never spoken plainly, but he returned from those mountains alone. He described the gold, veins nearly 2 feet wide, rich and unbroken, glowing with the weight of fortune. For years he had returned to that place, working it in silence, taking only what he could carry, keeping the secret sealed. But the secret hadn't stayed untouched. One season, 2 soldiers showed up in Phoenix with gold that matched his. Word was they had found something in the mountains. Waltz went back, and soon the soldiers were never seen again. There were others. A lone prospector, seen too close to the hidden trail. A nephew from Germany, sent by his sister to help him in his final years. But the old man had grown suspicious. The mine had made him paranoid, isolated, convinced that betrayal would find him if he let his guard down. So he acted. He described dragging the young man's body with a chain, burying him at a place called Agua Escondido, far from where anyone might ever stumble across the grave. And then, with something like resolve, or perhaps surrender, Waltz gestured weakly toward a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, he said, was the last of his gold, enough to prove that the mine had never been a myth, enough to honor a final request. If Dick were to take the gold, he must promise to send money to Waltz's sister in Germany, not for profit, for peace. The gold had taken many lives. Maybe it could still do some good. Dick agreed, and then, at last, came the directions. A canyon running north to south, a rock shaped like a man's face, a house built of stone. From the entrance to the mine, Waltz said, one could see the tip of Weaver's needle, but from the trail, the mine itself would remain hidden. He was fading fast, and just before Dick could ask the simplest of questions, whether the water in the canyon ran north or south, the old man slipped away. Jacob Waltz, the Dutchman, was gone. He left behind no map, only riddles, and a chest of gold sitting heavy in the corner of the room, glinting with the last light of a secret that had now passed to another. With the Dutchman gone and the gold in hand, Dick Holmes stepped into a story that was no longer just whispered. It was his now. He had listened carefully as the old man unraveled his guarded tale, collecting every hint, every cryptic description, and every fragment of memory Waltz had managed to voice. The directions had been far from exact, but they were all he had. A north-south canyon, a rock shaped like a man's face, a stone house nearby, and the subtle alignment of Weaver's needle, which was just visible from the entrance to the mine, but not from the trail. In the moment, it had felt like enough. But as Dick soon learned, the Superstition Mountains do not give up their secrets easily. He returned again and again to the range, riding through dry washes and stony gulches, scanning the skyline for that distinctive shape, a rock that resembled a man. But out there, everything begins to take on human form under the right light. Every boulder holds a face, every ridge a profile. Nothing stayed still long enough to be certain. Waltz had spoken of a stone house, but time had softened the line between nature and ruin. Crumbling outcroppings resembled shelter, ancient foundations now blurred by erosion. Dick found sites that matched the description nearly, but nearly wasn't enough, and still he pressed on. He followed what he believed to be the old government trail, one of several carved during the Apache Wars. Waltz had mentioned it, vaguely, but the problem was, there were at least 3 of these old trails, each twisting through different parts of the range. Which one had the Dutchman meant? Dick had chosen one. He couldn't be sure it was the right one. Worse still, he was no longer alone on the trail. The story had begun to spread. Rumors about Waltz's final days, the gold under his bed, and the young man who had sat beside him in those final hours. Some claimed Dick had stolen the gold outright. Others believed he had been given the true directions, and now carried a map in his mind. In a small town, gossip moves faster than horses, and soon Dick realized he was being followed. He would ride into the mountains, only to catch glimpses of others in the distance. Riders who stayed just far enough back. Campsites that appeared where none had been. The same kind of tracking he himself had once done to the Dutchman, now turned back on him. Sometimes he would abandon the search altogether, turning back to Phoenix before he reached the deep canyons, unwilling to lead anyone else too close. The mine had become a chase within a chase, not only a search for hidden gold, but a battle to keep others from discovering what he might already know. Still, he believed in the trail, and he sought confirmation wherever he could. One clue in particular haunted him: the Dutchman's story of killing his nephew and burying him with a chain around his neck, beneath a shelf of stone at Agua Escondido. So Dick returned there. He walked the ground with quiet precision, remembering the Dutchman's words, searching for any sign that might prove the tale was more than guilt-spun fantasy. And then, beneath a stone overhang, he found it. A grave. Inside he found bones, and wrapped around the remains, rusted but intact, a length of chain. The moment was grim, but it confirmed something vital. The Dutchman hadn't lied. His story, no matter how tangled, had roots in reality. There was truth beneath the superstition. And if that was true, then so was the mine. Dick Holmes returned to the mountains with renewed conviction, but the desert was vast, and time had worn deep into his joints. The clues still danced just beyond reach, and with each season, the journey grew harder. It became clear that if the search were to continue, it would need new legs. A younger man, one who understood the story and carried the same quiet patience. And so, Dick did what the Dutchman had once done before him. He prepared to pass the secret on. The mountains no longer welcomed him. Dick Holmes had spent over a decade tracing the Dutchman's clues, combing the Superstition range canyon by canyon, wash by wash. He had seen the desert under moonlight and thundercloud, walked it under stars and punishing sun. But now, his knees had stiffened, his body grown heavy, and the rides he once took with ease had become long and painful. The search had taken something from him, but it had also given him something, a kind of purpose that stretched beyond gold, a connection to the land, to the mystery, to the long thread of fate that had begun the moment he first heard that story by a campfire as a boy. Now it was time to hand it over. He turned to the one person he trusted with the truth, his son. George Brownie Holmes was 16, capable, observant, and already a product of the desert. He had grown up hearing pieces of the story, never the full version, but enough to feel the pull. Now, Dick entrusted him with everything. The original directions spoken by Waltz on his deathbed, the places to begin the search, and most importantly, the quiet knowledge that not all who entered those mountains returned. But Dick didn't just pass along the clues. He passed along his caution. The mine, he explained, was not only hidden, it was watched. Just as Dick had once tracked the Dutchman, and just as he himself had later been followed, Brownie too would be shadowed if he ever got close. The advice was simple, but firm. If he ever found anything, a landmark, a stone house, even the mine itself, he must show no sign. Walk past it, leave it, come back later when it was safe. The weight of this warning settled deep. It wasn't said with fear, it was said with experience. Together, they planned a trip into the mountains, father and son, side by side. But like so many things in this story, the plan frayed. From the moment they rode out, they sensed others on their trail, riders who moved like shadows, camps that appeared where none should be, eyes in the scrub brush, watching. Dick had seen it all before, and so, once again, they turned back. It was the last time Dick Holmes would ride into the Superstitions. The mountains had taken their toll. His body could no longer bear the climbs, the heat, the constant sense of being followed. But in his son, the search would continue. Brownie now held the clues, and just as Dick had done before him, he began to walk the lonely path that stretched out into the desert. He took a job at the Quarter Circle U Ranch, nestled deep within the range. It gave him both access and cover. From there, he could ride freely through the canyons as part of his work, observing the land, watching the light, listening for signs. But he was not the only one. The legend of the Dutchman's gold had grown, spreading beyond Arizona. Now, every drifter and cowboy with a pickaxe and a dream had heard the tale, and many came to believe Brownie had something the rest of them didn't. The final clue. Some offered trades, information, rumors, false maps, hoping Brownie might part with one of his own. He listened. Sometimes he nodded, but he gave away nothing of value. One cowboy told him he'd found a rock that looked like a man, just like the one described in Waltz's confession. He wanted to trade locations. Brownie declined. Not long after, the rock was gone. Some said it had been pried loose and thrown into a ravine. Whether out of spite or a desire to keep the secret buried, no one could say for certain. It was one more clue lost to time. But Brownie didn't stop. The mine was still out there, silent, sealed, and waiting. The trail was no longer just his father's. It was now his own. And like his father before him, Brownie would walk that trail for the rest of his life. For a time, the desert grew quiet again. Brownie Holmes kept to his rides through the Superstition Mountains, careful and watchful, always searching, but never speaking too much. He blended in among the cowhands at the Quarter Circle U Ranch, another weathered rider with calloused hands and far-off eyes. But the story never stayed quiet for long. In the summer of 1931, a man arrived in Arizona with something that hadn't been seen before, something dangerous and possibly priceless, a map. His name was Adolph Ruth, and by all appearances, He was an elderly man past his prime, silver-haired, limping, and weary from long travel. But Ruth carried with him what he claimed was a document unlike any other. A map, drawn in Mexico. Handed down, he said, from a line of men who once knew the mine's location. To most, it sounded like another tale spun in search of fame. But one detail made people take him seriously. Waltz, according to the legend, had stolen the mine from Mexican miners. If the map was real, it could predate Waltz's silence. It could point directly to the treasure before it ever became a secret. Ruth made his way to the quarter circle U, asking the ranch hands for help reaching the mountains. The cowboys were used to dreamers and gold chasers, but something about Ruth gave them pause. He was open, too open, talking about the map, about the clues, about the mine. He shared his plans freely, unaware that secrecy was often the only thing that kept a man safe in those hills. Brownie Holmes met with Ruth, and the two men talked at length. No one knows exactly what was said, but Brownie later recalled that the conversation lingered on the Dutchman, on the mountains, and on the dangerous attention a man could attract when he claimed to have a map. Summer in the Superstitions is no place for the unprepared. The heat alone can undo a man, and Brownie warned him. Others did too, but Ruth would not be turned away. When no one from the ranch would guide him, Ruth hired two lesser-known prospectors and entered the mountains with them. He was never seen alive again. Days passed, then weeks, and finally, in December, 6 months later, a bloodhound led a search party to a spot near a well-traveled trail. There, resting upright in the dust, was a human skull. It was found not hidden, but placed, carefully, some said, as though meant to be seen. The rest of the remains were discovered nearly a mile away, scattered and sun-bleached, as if someone had moved them. The cause of death was officially listed as exposure, with damage attributed to animals. But the skull had two distinct fractures, and the map, the one Ruth had spoken so confidently about, was never recovered. Suspicion turned quickly to the two prospectors who had led him in. They had returned without him, saying little, but with no hard evidence, no charges were brought. The desert had covered its tracks once again. Among Ruth's scattered belongings, a notebook was found. Inside was one final entry, written in Latin, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Beneath it, a cryptic line, 200 feet across from the cave. To some, it was proof. Ruth had found the mine, and someone had stopped him before he could return. To others, it was just a final flourish, a man determined to say he had won, even as the desert claimed him. For Brownie Holmes, it was another reminder, not of gold, but of danger. The mine, if it existed, was no ordinary place. It carried weight, and not every man who sought it would live to tell the tale. The legend had roared back to life. Adolph Ruth's disappearance, the eerie discovery of his skull, the cryptic notebook entries, all of it breathed new fire into a story that had never quite burned out. Newspapers, from coast to coast, picked it up. The Lost Dutchman's Mine was no longer just Arizona folklore. It had become national obsession. And yet, for Holmes, it was nothing new. He had lived beneath the weight of this mystery since boyhood. He had listened to it through the breath of his father, traced it through ridgelines, chased it through dust and distance, and now, more than ever, he felt its burden grow heavy. In the aftermath of the Ruth incident, the Superstition mountains were teeming again. Men flooded in with spades and theories, dynamite and half-truths, each one convinced they were the one to finally crack the code. And more than a few of them believed that Brownie Holmes, the son of Dick, the man who sat with Waltz, knew something they didn't. They watched him, followed him. Some tried to befriend him, others tried to manipulate him. But Brownie had learned well. He spoke little, rode alone, and when asked about the mine, he smiled in a way that said nothing. Still, he searched. There were moments of hope. After his father passed in 1933, Brownie reviewed the old clues with fresh eyes, trying to correct what might have been misunderstood. One detail in particular haunted him. The reference to the old government trail. Waltz had mentioned it near the end, but Dick had never been sure which one he meant. There were multiple trails used by the military during the Apache Wars, each winding through the region in its own direction. Dick may have followed the wrong one, so Brownie struck out anew, following a different trail, and one day, something unexpected happened. In a stretch of ground rarely disturbed, the desert winds had blown away a layer of sand. Beneath it, burnt fabric, charred scraps of old clothing, lying just as Waltz had once described. Brownie remembered his father's words, passed from Waltz himself, that one of the victim's belongings had been burned to hide the evidence. It was a grim confirmation. Not far from that spot, Brownie found weathered timbers, unnaturally placed and half buried. Waltz had claimed he'd hidden the mine by building a framework over the shaft, then covering it with rock and sand until it blended perfectly into the landscape. He had even said a mule train could pass over it and never know it was there. Could this be part of it? Even closer still, ruins, a crude structure, ancient perhaps, or merely old. It matched Waltz's reference to a stone house, one of the landmarks supposedly near the mine. It was all close, so close. But then, in 1945, the trail slipped from Brownie's grasp. His horse, startled and wild-eyed, reared and came down hard, crushing his foot beneath its weight. The injury was severe. He would never again ride the high canyons or scramble across the broken terrain. His time in the mountains, like his father's before him, had come to an end. Still, the story had one more chapter to offer him. Unable to search alone, Brownie turned to someone younger, someone he had quietly watched and quietly trusted. He would pass the trail once more, this time not to blood, but to belief. In the long shadows of the Superstition Mountains, where the air turns still and the wind moves like memory through the stone, the Dutchman's secret remains. Jacob Waltz had kept it well, so well in fact, that more than a century later, No one has ever confirmed they've found the mine he once described. Not Dick Holmes, who heard the story firsthand. Not Brownie, who spent decades riding the canyons. Not even Clayton Worst, who may have come closer than anyone. Each found pieces, scorched rags, hidden graves, shaped rock, lost timber, bones beneath stone, and gold, always gold, glinting just enough to keep the dream alive, but never the mine itself. Some say it never existed, that Waltz spun a tale from half-truths and hard luck, and that the gold he carried came from somewhere else entirely, stolen, traded, gifted. But those who saw the ore, those who held it, often said otherwise. It was too pure, too unusual, and always the same. Others believe the mine still lies beneath the desert, carefully hidden, just as Waltz said, beneath a layer of sand and stone, timbers buried deep enough that even the rains could erase every trace. The region has been blasted by dynamite, surveyed by aircraft, scanned by ground-penetrating radar. Men have searched for lifetimes, lost fortunes, lost hope. Some have never come back. Still, the pull remains. The fact that one man, through silence and sheer will, created a mystery so enduring that it has outlived every generation it has touched. Waltz never drew a map, never left a ledger. What he left behind was something more difficult to trace. A story, passed from memory to memory, like a secret just out of reach. Brownie Holmes died in 1980, having spent 72 years of his life searching. Clayton continued after him, moving carefully, never confirming too much. Even now, in the quietest corners of Arizona, there are those who still wander the canyons, watching the light shift across Weaver's Needle, looking for the next sign. A stone out of place, a trail too worn, a whisper from the past. They still search, because the Dutchman's gold has become something more than treasure. It has become a question. What lies hidden beneath our feet? What might we find if we follow the clues left behind by those who lived and died, chasing something they believed in? The answer, like the mine itself, remains buried and waiting. That's all for tonight's journey through history. Whether you're fast asleep or still drifting there, thank you for listening. Until next time, rest well.